Hi, everybody. It's Mary Rowe from the Canadian Urban Institute, President CEO here. Thanks for joining us. It's midday here in Toronto, and it's a little later in the morning in the West and a little earlier in the afternoon in the East. We are committed to having conversations across the country that reflect regional and local challenges. And we're at a particular moment, I think, in urban Canada and in urban places around the country where a lot of the preconditions that were challenging urban environments are now manifesting in really profoundly disturbing ways, disruptive ways, disconcerting ways. And I had described ages ago that COVID was like a particle accelerator. I stole that from a colleague of mine at the New York University who had talked about it for many years ago, an incident in Chicago where anything that wasn't working well really erupted into being completely dysfunctional once a particular stress. In that case, it was a heat wave. Here we are in a global pandemic and trying to come to terms with and reckon all the ways in which cities have been challenged and have potentially not been living up to their full potential because of various legacies. And one of the legacies that we live with here in Toronto is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of Credit, the Anishinaabeg and the Chippewa and the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat peoples. And it's now home to many, many First Nations, diverse First Nations from Inuit and Métis and across Turtle Island. Toronto was covered by Treaty 13, which was signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties that were signed with multiple Anishinaabeg nations. And I think that we're having a moment in urban life where we're having to acknowledge the legacy of injustice and the ways in which how our cities have been planned and built and designed and managed and governed and financed have reinforced patterns of segregation and isolation and exclusion. And I think it's a painful time. It's a particularly painful time for people of color, marginalized communities and vulnerable populations that are disproportionately experiencing the effects, the impacts of COVID. And it's raised a level of extraordinary anxiety for all sorts of folks in terms of how to reckon, how to reconcile, and also how to move forward in a productive and collective way that acknowledges those, as I suggested, pre-existing conditions, and then how do we move forward. And I think that the reason this session is so important this morning is because we rely on art and culture and the creative sector to help us see ourselves and help us navigate our history and our present and our future. And so I'm really pleased that these five have agreed to come on at a difficult time and offer their insights, and particularly when so much of our cultural expression is outside or not necessarily outside, but in shared spaces and in public or private, but places where we congregate. And I was thinking about this morning when I was walking, that we're now without so many of the experiences that bring us together across difference. We're not on transit. We're not in public spaces experiencing music or dance or having some transcendent experience. We're not even in our worship spaces. And so we're not getting the opportunity to see the other and to experience collectively something that helps us straddle difference. And I think that we're struggling with that. And isn't it interesting that the way that people are expressing their outrage to the way in which communities are being policed and the different forms of abuse that people are experiencing, isn't it interesting that what they do is take to the street, and the street being that fundamental public space that we forget is actually ours. It's actually owned publicly. Somehow we decided cars owned it, but really we own it. So I really am appreciative that you folks have come on, and we're going to have this conversation, and we're going to have many more conversations about this tough topic. Next week, we have more City Talk sessions planned, including one that the Black community in Canada is pulling together to talk about the spatial manifestations that have reinforced racism and how that needs to change. And so we partner with all sorts of folks. We're really keen for people that have ideas on how they'd like to participate in using City Talk in a constructive way and in an honest and frank way. We called these candid conversations, and I know this one isn't going to be any less candid than the others are. So I hope that my guests will feel free to speak their minds, tell us what you're struggling with, what you're seeing. We also focus these things specifically on what people are seeing. We've been trying to avoid having a platform where people just sort of, philosophically wax on. We really want to talk about what grounded in what's going on. And I think all of you have practices that are fundamentally grounded in real life and how culture reflects that. So we have a chat function here, and as anybody that's been on a City Talk knows, we record these sessions and we also record the chat. So we encourage everybody to participate in that chat. It's always great if at the beginning you just check in and tell us where you're watching from. So if you do that, that would be great. If you want to comment on things or ask questions, please direct your comments at the bottom to all panelists and everyone, because people on the chat have a lot of answers for each other. And we publish the chat, so just keep in mind what goes in the chat stays in the chat. People will see it. And as I suggested, the conversation continues. If you use social media, use hashtag #CityTalk. If you've got ideas for how we can deepen this conversation and have more opportunities to hear one another and to build urban empathy. CUI has been aspiring to be in the connective tissue business across the country and across differences. And if you have ideas on how we can continue to do that and program that in a useful way, please get in touch with us. You can write us at covidresponse@canurb.org. So what a great group we have today. And I'm really delighted that you took the time. And we're keen now to introduce each of you, and for each of you to just give us a kind of 90-second. Remember, you've got listeners across the country and you've got people from away, obviously, who don't live in Canada. Just give us a glimpse about what you're looking at, what you've been looking at for the last 11, 12 weeks, what you've been challenged by, and when we get into the group conversation, we can start talking about implications and all that kind of thing. So I'm just going to pick, if I can, Julie first. Julie Nagam, who's going to tell us where she is. She's in sunny Manitoba somewhere, and I want you to just give us a picture, paint a picture for us, Julie, of what you've been seeing and what's been on your mind for a couple of minutes over the last several weeks. Can you? Welcome to City Talk.
Thank you for having me. Really excited to be here. Yeah, sunny Manitoba, it's definitely true. We have some gorgeous weather. We're also experiencing some shifts that some of the other parts of the country have not. We've seen some reopenings and we've gone into a second phase, which is really opens your heart up and you get excited about thinking about those potential and possibilities. The biggest struggle for me right now as a person who works in cultural geographies and urban spaces, and in particular the inaugural artistic director for Nuit Blanche in Toronto, which is the largest public exhibition in North America, we can't gather in public space. This idea of that we can't engage in terms of the same way, and even just watching and thinking about participating in some of the movements. Tomorrow we have a big rally at the Legislative for Black Lives Matters. And so just thinking about that kind of fear and anxiety that starts to come where you want to support the movement, but at the same time, you're worried about the current climate that we're experiencing with COVID. And I think that, we're looking at alternatives of how we're trying to think about, online this and online that and pivot to digital media. And as somebody who works in digital media, it's disheartening to see that so many cultural institutions have left media out, and now they're forced to actually have to deal with it in not so many interesting ways. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, well, good. That gets us off to a good start. That'll raise some interesting stuff. Okay, Michael Hidetoshi Mori, tell us where you are, where you're speaking to us from, and what your perspective is, and then I'm sure we're going to circle back on what Julie just mentioned. Go ahead.
Absolutely. So I'm here in Toronto, working from home, as we all are, at Tapestry Opera. It's going to be a 33-degree day today, so I'm looking forward to that. Gosh, there's been so much. I think what I've been thinking about the last few days and seeing the last few days is reflecting on our capacity as a society to reflect now. We have more time. A lot of those things get brushed under the rug because we're busy humans. A lot of those things that we let go of because the next thing comes up, we now have the time to think about. And I think that does relate to what's been happening in the last week. And I think it's really healthy, actually. And I think that's also a thing that we're thinking about our sector. Look, in opera and classical music, it's often a feast or famine year. That means you have a big gig and that pays for the next 2 months. Then you have another big gig, and that pays for the next 2 months. And we're seeing people having those, which are often planned 1-2 years out, just being canceled one after the other after the other. And so this level of uncertainty is challenging, but the time for reflection is very, very interesting. We're starting to hear a lot about people talking about the problems that they haven't really been talking about in meaningful conversations in a while.
Yeah, nothing like a crisis. Yeah. Okay, Daryl, let's talk to you.
Hello, I'm in Edmonton right now on Treaty 6 territory. I'm the artistic director of the Citadel Theatre. And yeah, we had a show and have its dress rehearsal March 13th, and then we walked out of the theater and locked the doors behind us, and the set is still standing up there waiting for us to return. For us as a theater, our two performance spaces, our main spaces, are both like 650 seat spaces. So even though Alberta right now is about to head into sort of the second phase of reopening, we know that like it's going to be months, like New Year at best, before we're able to gather again in any large capacity. And it speaks to exactly how you started. Like everything about theater is about the communal gathering, about us coming together and sharing space and sharing stories in sort of a live ephemeral moment, right? So everything we are is the opposite of what's prohibited or what's allowed by COVID restrictions right now. So trying to figure out how we connect and how we express and how our artists keep going in the face of all that is a huge challenge right now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one of the things that I'll come back to you on there is just income support for artists who, the sector has no money now. So how are artists surviving? They're all collecting, they're all on, I'm assuming, of either on wage subsidy programs or they're collecting the emergency relief benefit. But, what is the financial viability of the sector? So we'll talk about that in a second. Heather, okay. Heather Igloliorte. That's my Heather, we're glad to have you. You can pronounce your name correctly for people, but talk to us about where you're coming from and what you've been seeing.
Hi everybody, I'm in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, and I'm from Nunatsiavut, and I have been in this room, formerly the least used craft room in my house, and now the most used room in my house. This is my 8,000th Zoom meeting, and I think that what's exciting to me is, I know we're in a moment right now, and there's a lot going on, but I have found that I've been really, really grateful to be able to build an online community. And I think that there's some interesting things to reflect on. I think that Inuit have actually been using social media to build an online community for quite some time, because all of our communities are fly in or boat in or skidoo in only for the majority of them. We don't have a lot of roads connecting us. So Inuit have been using Facebook and other social media for a long time to get together. And so what I've seen is that we've actually been able to build community in some really interesting ways and get to spend time together. And it's not just, my organization is the Inuit Futures in Arts Leadership Partnership Grant that has been doing online workshops with artists, led by artists, sometimes just for Inuit, sometimes for Indigenous people, sometimes for the public. And what we've found is that people actually are getting a lot of strength from being able to be together in a virtual space. Yeah. The other thing that I'm sort of looking forward to is our opportunity to rethink museums right now in this moment. If we can't travel between outside of our cities or outside of our provincial bounds for a long time, then that's going to force museums to think really critically around the neighborhoods that they're in and the publics that they serve that are their immediate publics. And so not an international art audience, not a national art audience, but a who's in my community who we can draw in right now. And that's going to force a lot of museums, I think, to dramatically rethink the kinds of exhibitions they're doing and the programming they do and how they bring community in. So I'm interested in community online and then when we can all be together again.
Yeah, wow, you're right. I mean, we all know of examples around the world of museums that have a larger international audience and the locals don't even know it's there.
Yeah, exactly.
And isn't it interesting? Part of the work that we're doing at CUI is a project called Bring Back Main Street, and we're trying to actually highlight there are local assets that are maybe a block from you. And but you're just raising an interesting point. Can those institutions pivot to actually producing I'm sure that people you're giving us lots to come back to. Okay, Noémie Lafrance, hi, where are you tuning in from?
I am in Montreal. Thank you for having me. And I was unsure if I should come on this panel at first. I spoke with Emily and we had a short conversation over email. As I feel that, perhaps some of my ideas this wasn't the right platform for it, but she encouraged me to come on. And the thing that maybe rubbed me a bit the wrong way was just this idea of underground solution and that sort of thing. And I felt like I am not thinking about those things at the moment. I talked to Emily about, what I see mainly is global systemic failure and something that really needs to be addressed. And I'm grateful that there are more people that are actually starting to see that. Things have changed quite a bit, actually, even since then. Things are changing all the time. And now we're really talking more openly about systemic racism and institutionalized racism. I think it's important to acknowledge that we're all white practically on this panel.
I don't know if your Indigenous colleagues will agree with you, but
no, I'm in
that's why I said almost, yes. What I would say is that we have to think, or I'm sorry if I'm breaking the news to anyone, but capitalism is itself racist, and so we have that problem. I mean, it was built on slavery, and it really operates on cheap labor. And, we see that when we're talking about essential workers, when we're talking about immigrants. I've gotten all these letters from arts organizations from New York City, because that's where I used to operate in solidarity with Black Lives Matter and all of the movements that are happening right now, where people are really coming down and acknowledging their white privilege and their own institutionalized racism and in their own office spaces, and admitting that they can work harder to actively practice anti-racism. Trudeau also mentioned something on Monday. He didn't really mention the Native American communities that haven't really been acknowledged. In Quebec, we also have Law 21, which is fundamentally racist. I was recently invited also to do a show by a pretty prestigious organization in Montreal to work on the work of Dany Laferrière, who's an Asian Canadian literary artist. And I let them know that I wanted to address racism in the work that I would present. And a week later, I was told that I probably wasn't the right person for this. So I just want to say that, we're not out of the woods here, and, and let's not forget some of the controversies that happened in Quebec recently with, white artists making work about slavery. And there are many, what I'm talking about. So, I asked the question, where is art and culture going? Well, I think it's not going anywhere. It's not going anywhere. We think COVID is a step back because of social distancing or lack of funds and economic impact. I think it's going nowhere until we address these issues. And otherwise, we don't really have anything relevant to say, And if this pandemic has unveiled things, I mean, it sends us to the past, and it's going to force us to actually face the things we haven't faced yet. And I think trying to plow through to make the same old stuff in this virtual world or standing apart from one another in public space, why? What is the point of that? And, it could have been easier for us to deal with these structural racism issues when everything was up and running normally and we had the money and we had the things to do things, but we were too busy to care about that. So now we might have to do it in a different climate, and in a climate that looks more like the climate of discrimination, where you don't have what you need because you've been considered last, So the two things I want to bring up about in relation to art is, one, face our entanglement in capitalism as artists and as art makers, and two, realize our true role in society as artists. So I'll talk about that, once we get going, but I don't want to take too much time.
That's
but
okay.
That's my.
So I guess the question is, for all of you to think about and reflect on, which is the point that a number of you touched on, and now Noémie's made it very direct. Is there a moment now, folks? Is there a moment where we can emerge from this and do things quite differently? Can I get a sense from other folks if you're seeing that? And Julie, you actually started to say some things were happening.
I was like, I wanted.
Can you get? Go.
Well, so here's the thing is that, some of us have been working on decolonizing for over 20 years. And for some of the people that we stand on, some amazing women and men and two-spirited folks that have been doing that work for an extremely long time. And I just think that it's such an interesting moment for me to think about how some people need to recognize that, but the rest of us have been trudging along doing that work for a really, really long period of time. And so, the harder question is for museums and galleries is that they weren't accessible spaces for BIPOC folks. And so we've been pushing and pushing and pushing, and we look at examples of Leanne Martin's calls to action. We look at the TRC's calls to action. There are moments of, where anti-racism then has to deal with the fact that they're on colonized land. And so we've got all this really great collaborations and things that have been happening within galleries and museum spaces. The issue is that we've been banging on those doors for a really long period of time, whether it's been pre-COVID, post-COVID, and for another, decade or so. And so I think that we've been really doing that work, and sometimes that work is unrecognized. And so the moment right now is that we actually have this platform and opportunity to keep pushing and radically shift those structures, because those structures are broken. And not only are they broken, they're not functioning, because we can't actually live in the society that we were currently living in.
Okay, who else wants to weigh in on this? I mean, Heather, do you want to, I saw you nodding away. Do you want to? And then I want to hear from the gents as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. And I'm a little distracted because there's a smudge on my contact lens. It has been like making me want to do this the whole time. Sorry, I'm trying to be able to see clearly. Julie's totally right. It's a situation where right now maybe we can grab onto this opportunity and really push through what we've been wanting to. The TRC era has brought a lot of things, this conversation to the fore, particularly around anti-Indigenous racism in this country and what we can do to make change. And we're seeing a lot of institutions kind of scrambling to catch up now to the work that has been done by activists and artists and scholars for so long. And I think that there's a real opportunity for us to grab this moment and really push through the kind of lip service or the tokenist kind of inclusion that we've been seeing in some degrees, and to really just work towards radical inclusion in all of our arts institutions.
I can speak as a consumer and an appreciator of arts and culture. People are just so hungry for it. They're hungry for the leadership that you can provide to help people navigate this. And as you suggest, some kind of, the other thing is that I think policymakers and decision makers actually don't really know what to do on a number of fronts, right? They're kind of making it up as they go. Nobody really knows. And I think there is this moment of willingness to acknowledge, in a way, I'm not suggesting, Noémie, that everybody is agreeing with you that capitalism is fundamentally flawed, but I think that there's a much broader awareness now that what was happening before it wasn't working. And we see that in all the programs that we're doing, that people are saying all the ways that the systems are failing now are because they were failing before, right? So can I just hear from Michael and Daryl, as you're both producers of cultural events, and you're compromised in your ability to actually produce anything physically right now. But what's your response to what these three gals are raising around really fundamental systemic change? Who wants to go first? Daryl?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, speaking like on behalf of the theater, this is our chance. There's no other opportunity when we can't create the art that we were meant to create. Like, it's a time for us to really not only rethink the art that we're supporting and the artists on our stage, but like systematically how we as an organization are built. That now's our chance to do it, and to pivot away from the idea of like when things get back to normal, because that's not the goal anymore. It's not like to get back to the normal programming or the normal way we did it. But
can I pursue you on that, because we're facing that as well. I feel like it's incumbent on everyone that's got an organizational affiliation or an institutional home. Are we actually going to do our own work and actually do the kind of a proper analysis and correction that we need to do to address the systemic racism that exists in our own institutions? Is that happening within your world, your administrative worlds?
Yeah, we see that starting to happen more and more in sort of professional theater in Canada. I mean, I have a call after we finish this panel with the PACT, which is the Professional Association of Canadian Theatre, which is all about that. Is about starting to set up the resources for theaters to be able to do that kind of audit of their own systems and infrastructures. I mean, whether or not individual organizations take advantage of that, that's up to their leadership. But for us at the Citadel, that's what we're looking at this time for.
And was that spurred by COVID, or is it accelerated it, or what?
Both. I mean, like certainly spurred by COVID, the start of how do we have to change the way we relate to our audiences and artists, but certainly, over the last few weeks and the last month to really say, hey, this is much more than just surviving that like month of COVID was bad and we had to shut. Now it's like we have this window. How do we change?
Yeah. What about you, Michael?
I listened to a great podcast for someone who does online counseling, and she was talking about the kind of relationships that benefit from being locked in a house together. And I think that, like in a way, I mean, regardless, it brings truth to your relationship. So there's a bunch of people who had been married for decades, and then they had to live together for a month and decided to divorce. Other people who had differences but were more related to circumstance lived together for a month and like doubled down on their love for each other. I think like that this crucible that we're in gives us an opportunity to discover the truth. A lot of the truths that we knew about, and kind of where I said like this is our time for not only reflection but doing the work. Look, I work in opera. The public perception of opera is that it's possibly one of the most colonial art forms out there. And though my company works exclusively in contemporary work, and we work with a lot of people representing Turtle Island and the great diversity that is Canada. So I think it's a great opportunity to hold up the mirror. I know the artists are calling for it, and I can see that happening. And I certainly know that in the past, artists haven't felt as comfortable being critical of the sector that they work in, because every job is fragile and needed. So I think it's an incredible opportunity not to just learn about how to do digital, but to have that self-reflection and say, yeah, we know this was wrong. We can actually take time to spend on making that right. And that might actually fix some of the things that were actually wrong with our model in the first place. The fact that we're not reaching the full diversity of our cities, for example. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think it's interesting to have this captive audience. This might be the only time arts organizations for a long time have said, well, if we had the time and the resources, we could totally do that. We have enough time. I think we have enough resources, and we have a lot of the right will.
I just want to
just a sec before you do, I'll come right back to you, Julie, but I just want to encourage people on the chat to direct your comments to all panelists and attendees. If you do it to panelists, only 6 of us see it. It'd be much better if you could direct it to everybody. So people like Kathy Allen and others who have sent it only to panelists, can you post your comment again, but post it so that everybody sees it? Okay, Julie, jump in.
Sorry, I was just going to add that, even last year, I was part of the organizing committee for the Canadian Arts Summit. And at that moment, we've talked about the diversity and the struggle in terms of, and I organized a panel about art and the power of politics. And how many times I was asked on multiple occasions, plus my other BIPOC fellow panelists, if we were the diversity panel. And so for me, in my mind, like the arts sector is still struggling in terms of not even just to get there conceptually, but it's just so important to have people in positions of leadership and BIPOC voices at the table that are actually making those decisions. And if we don't get to that point, then we're never going to see any kind of change. So, you know, and when we look at universities and institutions, I know a big, like Heather's project that you just mentioned, but our career and our focus has been about mentorship and training of Indigenous and people of color to think about how they could actually, you know, have that education and be able to be doing incredible work in the field. And so it's so important for us to continue to foster those, because each year that goes by, I've seen over the last 15 years of being a professor, is that this shift is coming. The more and more we are armed with education and opportunities and leadership positions, there's no chance but eventually a full takeover. And I think that, you know, we are going to see it and it's going to happen. And I think it's already starting to make so many people in those positions of power uncomfortable because they're scared to react, but then they're also scared to give up their positions of power. And so that to me that's the fundamental shift. It's like you can program all the things, you can invite all the right people, you can host community into that space, but the real systematic change is BIPOC people in leadership positions, full stop.
Yeah, Noémie, you galvanized the whole riff of the conversation there that people have been responding to, and I just want to, on the chat, also to encourage people to post resources. I see Bridget McIntosh has put a video up. If you've got resources or things that people should be, that you'd like to share with people, please feel free to put those in the chat, because the chat gets published afterwards and these are important things for people to see. Noémie, I want to see if you want to comment on what your colleagues have thrown in onto this conversation. And also, at some point, I want to talk to you about McCarran Park, because you did a project there. I used to live in New York. I know McCarran Park well. And I don't know whether you've seen the photographs coming out of McCarran Park over the last few days. It's been, yeah, I'll send you some. It's been extraordinary. What's happening in the evenings in McCarran Park is that people are going to McCarran Park in socially distanced clumps with their masks on, and they are sitting silently witnessing that Black Lives Matter, the injustice that exists because of systemic racism. And Brad Lander, who's the city councilman there, was posting some photographs, and I then dug around last night and saw unbelievably stirring how, and McCarran Park, as you know, is this is a park in Brooklyn, everybody, built by Robert Moses. It's a pool and a park, and it's been a contested public space, I think. Would that be fair to say, Noémie, for years? And yeah, here it is being used in a particular way. So I want to just give you a chance to comment on what your colleagues have been saying and thoughts you might have about the public space piece of it, where I know amount of your practice has been expressed.
Well, it's beautiful. You can't see everything everywhere. There's so much protest going on all over the world. And it's, it's really moving. It's really inspiring. That space, I think, has always been charged with all kinds of, community struggles. But, to go back to sort of like the role of art, I think one thing I can use the McCarran Pool as an example. One thing that I see art can do that other things cannot do is to transform perceptions. And, transforming perception has a tremendous value in many, many ways. And sometimes it gets transformed in a monetary value, but it has value that's beyond monetary, because it opens up the imagination and it permits people to see something else that wasn't, and a very simple example with the McCarran Park Pool is that it was seen as an eyesore. And that when we transformed it into this performance space, now all of a sudden the graffitis, which we had to fight to keep, by the way,
I'm sure.
All the things that the space represented in both its sort of derelict state and its past and its sadness, it also was beautiful. And so that just to be able to see that beauty really transformed everything, and it transformed the politicians' perception of what could be done there. And I think that this was really the true unlocking of this situation. There were 20 years of community work and you know, and all things to try to address this this space, which was also issues of racism, because there, you know, they didn't want the Black kids to come swim, and you know, there were all kinds of things. That's part of the reason why it closed in the first place. But so, you know, and so to go back to the you know, the artists making, you know, a critique of society, I think we've been in a dilemma a long time with this idea that artists can critique the system, but they're also kind of stuck in the system. And so, you know, the reality is that nobody can really exist fully outside of the capitalist system. It just isn't possible. And then on the one hand, I think art has been climbing the ladder of capitalism in the last 20, 30 years. You know, there's been more money in the arts. There's been, you know, the creative sector, which kind of in the entertainment world, you know, is kind of like running parallel with the art world. And, you know, there's more artists. Being an artist is much more common, and it's much more appreciated, in fact, or desirable. There's more people who want to be artists. You know, there's the possibility of doing, having a career as an artist, which I think, you know, 50 years ago wasn't the same thing.
Right.
So, you know, that we can see that as a good thing, you know, because art is being supported, and artists were also a segment of society that was underpaid and underappreciated, and that is also embodies this idea of precarity, you know. So, you know, there's also that side. And that idea of precarity, which promotes the mentality that sustains capitalism, is that artists are imaginative, they're resilient, they're flexible. And I think we have to just be careful of these notions, because the basis for these values brings a lot of people in power to ask artists for solutions, you know, and this is also a form of instrumentalization, you know, of art. So I think we just have to be concerned with these contradictions, because ultimately, you know, art's ideas have to have a full independence. I think that's really important. So
Yeah.
I'll leave it at that for now. But, you know, I think these are contradictions and things that, you know, art is very powerful, but when it becomes instrumentalized,
Yep.
it takes a different form.
And I think you're right that we've had 2 decades of instrumentalization, where the argument for public spending in art is often justified as it's an economic development tool. It's interesting to me, where does this pick up with the idea that you're actually going to encourage places to go local now? So it's not going to actually be about tourists and attracting tourists. Is it actually more about grounding culture, artistic and cultural practice in the neighborhood? You would start to suggest that, Heather. Is that a way of responding to what Noémie's raising here?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're saying and what I'm hoping is that we're not going to come out of this forgetting who it is that got us through it, because that's, you know, it's not fucking Damien Hirst who's supporting the world right now. It's artists in their living rooms doing workshops and doing performances on live and Facebook streaming their artwork and teaching others how to make things. Like, everything that we are benefiting from right now is a lot of, it's, you know, it's LGBTQ, it's BIPOC, it's community activist organized artists who are going out of their way for little or no pay to really make change in the world. And what would we do without television and art and performance and music right now? We would all be going out of our minds. Like, the only thing that is supporting people is the arts. And I hope that when we are done with this, we see the value. Well, we don't come out of this and forget again. And we never have to hear that rhetoric from politicians ever again, that the arts have no value, because it's literally the only thing helping us right now.
Yeah, it's kind of like, duh, I hear you. Can I hear, though, from the folks who have actual venues? Because the question is, I appreciate that we've made this digital pivot, and I'm with you. I'm extremely dependent myself on having some kind of experience beyond my own Zoom head. But in terms of digital, can we straddle, folks? Are we going to be able to make this transition and recreate opportunities to actually have some physical congregating activity in a safe way? Who's thinking about that? Michael, are you? You're going to
Yeah,
take
for
Opera,
sure.
you're going to take Opera Main Street and put it in a park? What can you do?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we will be announcing something like that pretty soon. There's some safe ways to do things. All of it relates to the outdoors, which is and to things that sort of are equitable for people finding. I think parks may be a little bit dangerous because there's a natural will to convene when you see something cool. But I think really being creative about what spaces are out there and how we can use them.
Can't we share, Michael, can't we share parks in a safe way? Come on. Honestly,
yeah.
that pretty,
Draw this. We can draw the
that
circles.
pretty Bellwoods meme has now gone across the world that somehow a certain group of Torontonians are horrible in the park. There were many, I live in the East End, there were many parks where people were totally socially distanced. It was all safe, blah, blah, blah. I don't want you to abandon parks and say, oh, we can't be bothered with parks.
No.
Okay.
You're right. But I'd like to say that there are lots of possibilities, and I guess I want people to turn the switches as soon as possible to say the possibilities aren't indoors in large gatherings, probably for a little while. But however, there are interesting ways. Look at summer. We have this opportunity now to think about how we can make art safe.
I mean, if you look at these extraordinary acts of protest that are occurring in cities around the world, as I suggested, they're on streets. Is there an opportunity for us to retake over streets now, to be streets for people? I don't know. What Daryl, where are you at in Edmonton on this? I know that you've got protest activity there as well, but the Citadel, I don't know if the Citadel has a history of performing outside. Do you?
No, we don't. We and like all other cities, like all of the sort of summer festivals and large gatherings are canceled. But I think Heather made such a good point too, right? That like there's this great Mo Willems, the children's book author, has this great quote of like scientists will get us out of this, but artists will get us through it. And I think it's that, right?
Wonderful
it's
quote.
that way that artists are connecting, and so seeing like. There's a great group of artists from Stratford now, the big Stratford Festival, that have started to perform out on the street in front of people's porches, right? You can book them to come and perform in front in small groups.
Really?
Yeah, and that kind of, so like artists are trying to find ways to connect, and part of that is going to be how we connect digitally, like what that looks like, and like how for theater at least, how it preserves the liveness of theater and that element, because just recording it is film. We've already got that. So how to find that, and how over the next while to start to increase the ability that, like, as we can gather in larger groups, how do we find ways to engage outside, or engage in smaller groups inside, or to do hybrids of shows for a small audience live and stream it at the same time, like what those things are, because ultimately, we want to keep communicating and creating work. And to one of your earlier points, like the artists both have the like artistic need to create and the desire to keep employed, like to find ways to keep money coming in. So finding that balance over the next little while, as we can't gather and create in the way that we're used to.
Daryl, can you repeat the name of the author that you suggested that had the quote about science, whatever it was, and art will help us get us through?
It's Mo Willems. I have 2 young sons and read his books all the time.
Okay, Emily's put it. Emily's.
I'm so glad to hear that there are plans, because I'm most worried about performance artists, because museums, you can do all kinds of things to social distance and go see visual art still and experience it in different ways, but being in a theater together is probably going to be the very last thing that we do. So it's I'm most concerned.
Mm-hmm. Can I now, Noémie, I want to circle back on your hesitance to come on because you felt you're not engaged and on the ground, and that you want to bring it up to not just 30,000 feet, but several miles of feet up, to say that we're in global collapse. How I guess part of what our advocacy at CUI is about that it's time for a new deal for cities. We talk about this, a new deal for cities, that municipal governments aren't funded in a sustainable way. Do you think that this moment could actually be so seminal that it's like a new deal for artists, like a new understanding of how art is financed and how art's created, how you have a number of your educators, how people are being taught? Is there a window, do you think, for that kind of change?
I think definitely, but I think that we have to harness that. And I think in order to harness that, we have to ask ourselves some deeper questions. You know, I think we're skipping steps trying to go to logistics. You know,
Right.
we're not in a place where we should be asking ourselves like, oh, should it be outside? Should it be, you know, people ask me that a lot because I used to do work in public space. Well, my work has nothing to do with, you know, the issues of social distancing, you know, that's just a practical matter. And, you know, I think by thinking about what got us there and what this situation means, even, you know, I was listening at a podcast by the artist Anika Yi, who works with microbes, and she works with Sens and, you know, all kinds of very interesting stuff. And she said, well, I had to do a crash course on viruses, but, you know, what's really interesting about viruses is that they are, well, the way that she explains is they leak, right? So they're considered to be at the borders of life, right? So it asks questions about what is life, what is non-life, because viruses are their DNA, basically. So it's kind of a way to share DNA without being your own DNA. So it kind of goes into these ideas that, you know, we're made of 8% viruses, actually. There's thousands and millions of viruses in the world. They come in and out of us constantly, and they are kind of like plugging into our DNA and changing things. You know, there's things in viruses that happen like the plague that gives you immunity to HIV. Like there's all kinds of crazy stuff going on with that stuff. And so we don't understand all these things, but one thing we can understand of this is that it really challenges what is life. It also challenges what is an individual, you know? And so all these questions are very interesting, you know, because we've been living in these kinds of ideas where we think that we're separate from one another and we have these functions, and then there's all these cells with these barriers, right? And these countries, but in reality, that's probably not really true. You know, we're made of microbes and viruses. So, and all these things are moving around between people. When you shake hands, you share a million, you know. Yep. So now we're trying to protect ourselves from this particular virus. And this is like one thing. There's gonna be more viruses. And this thing is gonna last for another 3 years. And, you know, so we have to be realistic about some of these things. And not think like, okay, well, yes, we gotta eat and we need a job and we need these things right now. Like you gotta eat today, not, you know, you can't just be thinking about this. But I do think that there's so much to think about. I also like what Arundhati Roy says, the virus is a portal. You know, I don't know if you guys had a chance to read that article, but she says, we can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us, or we can walk through lightly with light luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it.
Wow. Emily, our producer, who Noémie, you mentioned at the beginning of your comments, is diligently trying to post as many links as she can. And she just put up Arundhati Roy's article into the chat. So well done. Michael, I think you're ready to get in and say something.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I've seen is also an incredible stability in artists since they've started receiving CURB or CERB, whatever you want to call it. And I don't know that I would have said this before, but I would advocate for a universal basic income for artists. I think that would change the outlook of arts in Canada, because I've seen so many artists transition into other professions just because of the viability of it, and we lose a lot of talent. So it's just an observation. I think we've already learned that people have benefited from CURB. It's the first time they've had a monthly steady guaranteed income, for freelance performers. It's just something that's interesting, and that I would be very interested in exploring more.
I also wonder about CERB. I know that the government must be just wringing its hands trying to figure out how it's going to afford to continue to offer it, because I can't imagine how they're going to be able to stop. I think it was only supposed to be for another month or so, and how is that possibly going to happen? But it's not just your sector, but it's people in service sectors. So if retail, for instance, can't come back fully, then the only way that they potentially can work for a restaurant or any kind of, where a lot of artists work part-time, is if CERB is extended, and then they have an amount of money that they can make up to a certain limit, right? Okay, Heather, do you want to jump in? You're muted. Unmute yourself there, Heather.
Sorry, my husband is like making a smoothie or something in the background. I was just going to agree with what Michael's saying, that I think that universal basic income, we should implement it universally. That's the whole point, right? Is that it is more effective and less expensive than all of the other sort of hodgepodge of programs that we run. And making more difficult for people to just access basic living expenses. I think that, like Noémie was saying, we need to think about what society is going to look like when we come out the other side of this. Mm-hmm. And who do we want to be? Do we want to be beholden to the world's first trillionaire and like living, destroying this planet for like crap? I think that there's an opportunity here.
We're kind of rounding the corner on this discussion when we have to break, but I'm wondering if anyone wants to weigh in on the notion of how digital and real, I don't know what the antidote to digital is, digital and physical maybe, or space, can they coexist? You've been talking about how your practice is changing, your organizations are having to change, you're having to do equity audits, these kinds of sudden wake-up calls that this confluence of factors is forcing us to do. Do you see the digital realm and the physical realm coexisting?
I think for a lot of us, they do. They always have. The problem is that institutions have to catch up to it. So, they've been lack and they haven't been as interested. And it's like, oh, our website's not doing so well, or, oh, we don't have that, or, oh, you need that 4K projector? Oh, we don't actually own that in the museum. So we have to go and get some other kind of projector to do something, subpar. And I'd say that, we've been asking, especially as a digital media artist, it's like we've been asking for people to pay attention to digital media art. And then you watch, some institutions doing it really well, like the Sydney Biannual did an excellent job of closing and then shifting into a really strong digital realm, and then they've now reopened. And then on the flip side, if I see another middle-aged white lady director talking about the importance of her collection in the museum, I'll probably start crying of boredom. So I just feel like there's these two kind of, extreme things that are happening. And I think that the good part is that, of course, the digital realm is part of our realm. As we look to the future, we have no choice but to think about how digital technologies are going to continue to not even be embedded in our physical day practices. I mean, everybody's on a handheld, somebody's got a watch, other people got iPads and things, and eventually I'm sure they'll get chips embedded into their bodies. And so I just feel like, I think that's an inevitable movement. And I think that it's a big miss for arts and culture. And I think it's a really big wake-up call, because Canada Council had advertised their digital strategy and they had tons of money because nobody had applied, because nobody cared about digital strategies. My guess is that digital strategy is going to be overloaded in this round.
It is interesting though how, Heather, it is interesting though how what you're suggesting had already been present in the Inuit community and in communities that had already had logistical challenges. And I feel like that with Canada generally. We have very few cities really. We're a huge geography. And so it's been hard to stitch together a shared narrative in the country that's focused on place. And now digitally, it's now a given that we're going to have these kinds of conversations, right? Okay, Heather, you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I was gonna say, and I agree with what you're saying. And I think that, like, as a curator in my field, everyone is talking about digital exhibitions and how we're going to be I know we've said pivot a lot of times in this call, but how we're going to pivot. And, you know, and exhibition is not a collection of JPEGs. So we need to really think through how we're going to use technology to share all these things that we've had in process. And a student sent me a link to a program called Gesso, and there was this fantastic online exhibition format where you can hear the artist talk and experience the exhibition as you kind of move through the space. Another exciting kind of development that I saw recently is the artists Scavanati and Jason Lewis did an entirely in Second Life exhibition. They did a virtual exhibition virtually where everyone had to kind of don their avatars in order to walk around inside. And I think that we're seeing some creative solutions to what is going to be a longer problem. You know, what does the field even look like? What is the point of collections? How do we access them? You know, maybe it will democratize a lot of this stuff. Museums have a long and colonial history of being elitist institutions that keep people out and are not welcoming even when they are public spaces. So, you know, when people don't have money for, even when museums open again, are we still going to be charging $20 to get, you know, school kids in to see the collections of the works? We're one of the only countries in the world, sort of first world countries that have such high prices for admission. So I think like we need to rethink a lot of different things because it's going to be a very different climate on the other side.
But you know, we have a chance to do that. I mean, because everything's up for grabs. You're all advocates, I gather, for the universal basic income, and I'm wondering if we don't also have to be advocates for universal.
I didn't say that.
Noémie, you would say that or you would not?
I'm not.
Okay, well then jump in, because what I was going to say is, do we also want to call for universal access to broadband? That was me making the equation, but go ahead, Noémie, what would you say?
Well, I was just actually going to comment on the internet, on the technology. I think not only it's incredibly boring, this idea that, you know, we're going to shift to online, woohoo. And then I think we need to also think how incredibly scary, you know, it is. I would recommend another article from Naomi Klein in The Intercept about what's going on with big technologies and the intentions behind it on a really large scale. And, you know, I could just say the word surveillance, and, you know, there's many other concerns with this that I think, again, we shouldn't step too soon and too enthusiastically into this. I think we need to take another step back and realize that this was already in store for us, and it's been in the works for a long time. And now there's a lot of opportunistic money making, but also, you know, control mechanisms that are ready to be put in place with this.
A gazillion risks, I think. So we've only got a few more minutes, so I'm going to go around to each of you and just ask you for 30 seconds on if there's one thing that you are going to be focused on. What's the one thing that you feel, maybe it's around principles, maybe it's around your practice, maybe, what's that one thing? You know, we're coming up to COVID at 100, June 19, we'll have had 100 days of this. So in the next 100 days, what's the one thing that you're going to be really doubling down on thinking about, Daryl?
Yeah, in the next 100 days, it's going to be about community, right? How we start to build our relationship with our community again, both like ensuring that we're providing a platform and a voice to marginalized voices in our artistic community, but how we start to engage safely again with our audience and that community, how we build that sort of live ephemeral experience again together.
Yeah. Heather?
The next 100 days, I can think for, I don't know if I can think 3 months in the future right now. Right now for me, it's all about supporting our Black brothers and sisters and all across North America right now and what's going on. It's the top of my mind every morning when I wake up and when I go to bed at night, and what we can do to hold space and care for them.
Michael?
Honestly, in a very practical sense, the next 100 days are going to be finding safe ways to perform and connect with people outdoors, and making sure that as much of our budget goes to artists next year as possible.
Hmm. That's interesting. You're shifting your budget from not as much admin and more into artists? Is that what you mean?
I think it's just the rethink of the production model. What would have gone into production in a certain way? We want to make sure that doesn't just go into holding on to what we've got. That we find ways to pay as many people as possible next year.
Okay. Noémie?
I would say feeling and seeing the suffering of others is a focus that I think is really important and at the source of much of these changes.
I say the last three words again. I didn't hear.
I think at the source of much of these changes that are coming.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you, Julie. Last word to you.
Well, you know, I hope for some holidays, but I also, I really, in my mind, just to continue supporting BIPOC students and cultural workers, to continue to push them and get opportunities for leadership positions. And especially now, and especially for students, I know we talked a lot about artists, but a lot of students also fit in both of those realms, and cultural workers more broadly. And I just think that it's so important in terms of thinking about training and mentoring. And that's always my focus. And especially with, you know, all the granting opportunities that we have, it's just a continued push and support for BIPOC students and workers.
Great. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us on this. You know, COVID is not an equal opportunity afflictor. It has disproportionately affected some people. No one's experience is the same, but we know that, as I suggested, that some folks have suffered disproportionately and will continue to be struggling. We appreciate that we have to somehow find mechanisms for collective empathy for each other, but also coming to terms with collective failure, and then how do we move to collective success, and how do we double down in our commitment to that. So each of you has made such an interesting, poignant, practical, poetic, profound kinds of inputs into this conversation today. So thank you for getting the conversation going. Thanks for joining us in City Talk. Thanks everybody for the chat. Lots of really important resources there. Tomorrow we're back for a City Talk on with our one-on-ones with mayors, and I'll be with the mayor of Ottawa, nation's capital, talking about what he's confronting day to day there to run that city, and how sort of symbolic that is of what cities are dealing with across the country. And then next week, as I suggested, you'll look at your inbox, you'll see that we'll have 4 City Talks next week, one of which is going to be expressly focused on equity and the concerns of people of color and Black and Brown Canadians across the country. So thank you very, very much for joining us. And thanks to all 5 here for coming on to City Talk. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.